And what does equity mean to you? Because it turns out there's a lot of different definitions of it. And I'll share a couple that I'm familiar with in the work that I do, but I'd love to hear, what that means to you just from the heart, personally, professionally, when you think about equity, what does it mean to you?
So my name is Noah Wirtz. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the communications and outreach coordinator at Agrarian Trust. And equity, what it means to me, I guess to be very precise, we have two definitions that we deal with a lot in our work. The first is just equity in the terms of wealth building and assets. But I think the definition that's more relevant today is basically systems of change that address historical inequalities and create a level playing field in terms of opportunity and address differences in starting points that have been created by sort of histories of injustice and racial inequity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then I just wanted to also put an alternative question. You could just think, about answering why is creating equity important to you? It's another way of maybe coming at the same question, but just want to get a sense of where people are at. So, Valentine.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. That was really comprehensive. And I think, especially given that intersection between those, I'm somebody who works a lot in infrastructure. And I think it's in the hidden infrastructure that inequitable processes are often reproduced. So like little things like, I'm just gonna name this and with love and Colleen spirit, but like our Metropolitan Council in the Metro Twin Cities area makes everybody do projects they fund through reimbursement, and then they use the money from the interest that they gain to fund racial equity projects. And that feels like not using the equity to share it in an equitable way. Like if you actually distributed the money in the community and let the community build an interest, like that would be a structural change rather than, so it's, yeah, my motive is changing some of that infrastructure. Yeah.
I'm Gary Hampton. I'm a Twin Cities transplant, and I'm working on this project with Valentine. Also working with the National Urban Ag Initiative with renewing the countryside and also land access here in the Twin Cities. Also a co-op developer. So what does equity mean to me? Equity is taking into consideration that equality is a basic right, but is awareness of the availability of those opportunities that are out there, and then is the accessibility, the removing or minimizing the barriers of access for individuals through intentional action. That leads to socioeconomic empowerment that can elevate one's individual efficacy and their community efficacy based on the resources that are available, if given equality and equity of those resources as well, and guidance and ownership and control over stewardship of those resources for their communities. And that's why I think it's important.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Aleya Fraser. I'm with the Minnesota Land Trust. I serve as a land protection coordinator in our greater Twin Cities metro area. So I'm based in the Twin Cities, but I grew up in northeastern Wisconsin. So it's exciting to kind of hear about the work that's happening there as well. I primarily focus on conservation easements in my current role, but I think been really eager to get involved in this group. And I think to me, equity, thinking about it in the context of my work especially, is about access and reducing barriers to accessing land and accessing capital to access that land. And I think especially working in a conservation oriented field, it's also about reckoning with our very fraught history and racist history of land ownership and of environmental conservation, and the ways that the kind of community that I now work in has perpetuated some of those, you know, racism and exclusionary policies. Yeah, so I'm eager to work more with this group.
Hi, I'm Kara. I mostly work on helping people access resources they need to grow food with a focus on land. And I also work with Gary on the USDA FSA Urban Ag initiative. And I guess to me, similarly related to my work, I think of equity as creating or making sure people have access to the appropriate set of resources that they need to meet their long-term goals. And I will pass it to Megan.
I'm Megan Finney. I'm with the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance. I mainly do the children's garden program. And I guess I think a lot about equity as it has to do with young people and kids, really young kids and all kinds of kids. And I think it's, for me, it's that they have the opportunities that are out there, and not only just to see the opportunities, but help in accessing them. And whether that be the outdoors or gardens or growing food. So yeah, that's what I think about. And what else was we supposed to answer? I guess that was it. I don't know who's after me, but I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Megan. Hi, I'm Cherie Cueto. I am the coordinator for the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, where I primarily work with people in the Frogtown Rondo neighborhood, focusing on having community gardens and organic produce more accessible to the people in the community. And I guess as far as equality goes, I guess I would say embracing people's beliefs, embracing, appreciating, and understanding and respecting everybody's beliefs, the diversity of it. And just more inclusion as well of the, people's different backgrounds.
My name is Danny. I'm with the LEDC. We're the Latino Economic Development Center. I'm an ag associate, so we're really just focusing on getting capital to people who getting capital to Latinos who want to start a farm or want to start planting or want to start a ranch. And I think equity, what it means to me is, being able to have the same opportunities as everyone else in the same process to get those opportunities.
I want to ditto a lot of your answers. I don't know if I'll be able to add too much. Mia Jung, she, her, I'm in the Appleton area in Wisconsin. I work as a community development educator for Extension. And I do focus some of my work on farmland conservation and farmland access. I do think equity means working to empower and support people of diverse backgrounds. Also knowing that white supremacy affects our awareness and our actions in pretty much everything that we do. And so that means we often have to address the elephant in the room to be able to reach more equity and more opportunities for all. So thank you.
Excuse my runny nose. My name's Chuck Andaris. I work with Michael Field's Agricultural Institute in Wisconsin. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. And my position there is Associate Policy Director, so I work mostly on state policy stuff around sustainable agriculture and equity and climate and stuff like that. And it's a really interesting question to think about what equity means to me. And I think I think the answer to me is about power. So like an equitable society to me would be one in which someone, no matter who they are, has power to decide their own course. That no one has power over anyone. There's no coercion. Other communities aren't making decisions on behalf of other communities. And yeah, everyone has the same political, economic, and social power, that there's nothing given to any group or individual just because they were born male or white or straight or in a certain religious home or anything like that. So thank you.
Okay, and then lastly, Shelley, you said that you don't have your mic. So if you want to, just pop something in
She
the
put
chat.
it in the chat.
Okay, great. So we can just read that. So Shelley Rothman worked for Fox Head Regenerative Agriculture in Eastern Wisconsin. We work to strengthen our food and farm network, and with farmland access and conservation. Equity to me, everyone has equal access to land, resources, food, community, and opportunities. Beautiful. And thank you all so much for having me, but also for just sharing those beautiful words. I think it's just really grounding to hear everyone's voice and speaking in a common language around equity. And the most bare bones definition of equity that I encounter in my work with the Racial Equity Institute and working with DEI, across different companies and organizations, the idea that you could not predict someone's outcomes based on their race or any social characteristic, right? That's the just most bare bones definition, that you can't predict outcomes based on someone's race. Today in the United States, with 2 pieces of data, we can predict with stunning accuracy what your outcomes are likely to be in your life. All we need is your race, and what else? Can anyone guess what the other piece of data is?
Third grade test scores.
That's a really good guess. Gary, what were you going to say, Valentine?
Zip code. I'm a geographer.
Zip code. That's it. Exactly. Your race and your zip code. And so to quote the brilliant scholar John A. Powell, he says that today geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. I'm going to say that again. Geography today does the work of Jim Crow laws. So we don't have the Jim Crow laws of the past, and thank goodness, but we do still have that inequitable structure embedded in our society, and that lives on in food and agriculture, as we all know. And so just to ground us a little bit in a timeline, I like to share my screen, and we're going to talk about how we got here a little bit, and then we're going to talk about a lot of just really inspiring examples and nuts and bolts. We'll get into that of how different groups are organizing to really build community wealth and to redefine equity. The reality is, none of us have ever lived in an equitable society, so no one knows what it would look like and feel like to live in that world. But let's take a look and let's do some imagining together. So what I want to do again is just to share my screen real quick. Hopefully Zoom will grant me the grace I need to get this up. Sometimes Zoom is just wonky on my computer. Here we go. So how we got here, I want to share a timeline that was created originally by doctors Michael Bird and Linda Clayton. Has anyone heard of them? Let me see if I can see them. Anyway, they are 2 Harvard-trained physicians. They're 2 Black doctors who were married to each other, and they also published a book called An American Health Dilemma. And so they are just incredibly heavy hitters in their field, amazing scholars, physicians, masters of public health, both just brilliant people. And amazing that they're married, and so just what a dream team. And so they put together this timeline, and I just updated it. I adapted it to be able to present it, but you can find this in an online presentation that they gave. And so when we look at the time span of the nation we're living in, if we start in 1607 with the first permanent English settlement in the colony, which is really the DNA, where the DNA of the colonies and what becomes the USA is set down, really 1607. From 1607 till the year 2000, what was the biggest source of agricultural income for 400 years? Does anyone know the biggest source of agricultural income? Any guesses? For 400 years. Any guesses?
My guess is enslaved people.
Well, just agricultural products. When we're talking about what
Oh,
grew an agricultural income, as USDA would define agricultural income.
oh, cotton maybe?
A lot of people guess cotton, but the reality is actually cotton does not take off on the global stage until well into the 1800s. So it takes 200 years before cotton is major, because remember, the cotton gin's not invented until 1793. So there's no way to gin it. There's no way to separate the seeds from the bolls. So it's actually not cotton, it's tobacco, an incredibly addictive crop. For 400 years, that was the biggest source of agricultural income in the United States. So we really start our history as a glorified tobacco plantation. The vast majority of the laborers, 10 to 1 for the first 150 years are indentured servants from, in fact, Europe. People who were taken out of debtors' prisons and brought over here to work for free, to get their freedom back. They would sign these indentured servitude contracts of 4 to 7 years, typically. And then the first documented Africans arrive in 1619, which is where the New York Times gets the name of its 1619 Project. And for 258 years, all we will know in this nation is indentured servitude or chattel slavery. That's what we're going to know until 1865. Just take that in for a moment. 62% of the life of this nation, all we know is exploiting labor. That's it. So obviously, by the time the 1850s roll around, you really have cotton taking off. Sugarcane, in fact, would be the biggest arena where enslaved Africans were going to be working on sugarcane plantations. 70% of all people who were enslaved here worked on sugarcane plantations, not tobacco or cotton. So a lot of that is, knowledge that, it's hard to put that in context for a lot of people, because most of us haven't been taught that, that it was really tobacco for 400 years and a wildly addictive crop, of course, and very successful. And yet what happened to the tobacco companies? Don't think we can't break a 400-year dynasty in this country with some community organizing, because people organized, did they not? I don't know any other industry that has to create attack ads attacking themselves. Tobacco actually has to produce those ads. They were sued by 46 states because communities organized and forced the states to sue the tobacco companies, and that broke the back of big tobacco. So anything is possible, and that's because bartenders and airline stewards and people who were being exposed to secondhand smoke organized a major campaign that changed our society, and now you cannot smoke indoors. And the tobacco companies had to scale back massively and pay out tens of billions of dollars, which they're still paying out till this day in the tobacco master settlement to the states for the damage they did in our society, right? Because the states were picking up the cost of all of that lung cancer, and it was breaking the back of our healthcare system. So we did something about it. So we can make huge changes as a society, and that gives me a lot of hope. Now, looking from 1865 to 1968, another 103 years, all we know is Jim Crow legal segregation. So if you put those two numbers together, 87% of the life of this nation is spent in chattel slavery, servitude, and segregation. That's all we knew for 80% of the time we've been here, trying to create a set of colonies, and then later what becomes the US, right? Of course, our history as a landscape goes far back, millennia. But if we're just talking about the legal structures we're dealing with now, the social structures we're dealing with now, the roots of those are really in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. That's where we lay down that plantation agriculture economy that becomes, so powerful over the course of that 400 years. So that's why we begin there. But of course, the history of the landscape goes far back, millennia, and this is indigenous land, as we all know. And so, but I just want us to understand that we're dealing with 87% of our history in segregation, slavery, and servitude, right? Just exploitation. Now, from 1968, after we pass a Fair Housing Act to 2020, that's another 52 years, right? And since 2020, it's just been 3 years. That's 13% of the life of this nation, in which we can only say that most citizenship rights have been extended. Not all. People are still fighting for the right to vote, as we know, in this country. There's a racial wealth gap. We've got an achievement gap in our school system. We've got health disparities in our healthcare system. We've got implicit bias. We've got all of these challenges as a society. And I just want to ground us in the fact that we're only 13% into the current era in which we could say we are post-Jim Crow, because we didn't pass a Fair Housing Act until 1968. Again, I think that's important just to hold that reality for a moment, realize that we are very, very new at even being able to imagine what an equitable society could look like. We couldn't even imagine that before the 1960s. And in fact, 70 years ago, in most parts of this country, if we came together across racial lines, just like how we are in this room today, to talk about equity and racism and what that has to do with land ownership, we could be having the police called on us, right? In some communities in this country, we couldn't even have this conversation across racial lines 70 years ago. We couldn't even gather to talk about this without being worried for our personal safety. So we have made a lot of strides as a society, but I think it's important to realize that we're very, very young in the current era. We're very new to that current era. And that's why, no one really can claim to know what an equitable society would look like. We don't know. We've never lived in one. We don't know what it would look like and feel like, but we know what it wouldn't look like. We have a really good idea of that. And so I do want to share with you some amazing examples of community wealth building initiatives that are focused on communities coming together to own land and property and assets and businesses in common collectively. And so I'll pause here. Any thoughts or questions before we move on to the examples? Any reactions? Any just anything that people want to share before I do move on? Reflect that this timeline for me has been eye-opening. And I think you can look at it two ways. You can look at it and be overwhelmed by the fact that 87% of our history was spent in just a total inequitable arrangement. And that can feel overwhelming, but we can also say, for the first time in history, we can open the window and look out into the world and think, what could equity look like? So that gives me a lot of hope that we're just at the start of something very, very promising and very beautiful. But that doesn't negate the fact that we need to know our history, and know what odds are stacked against us. But yeah, any thoughts that people want to share or reactions? I'll check the chat too. And so I will take us toward looking at these examples. I'm going to assume that everybody's just like really eager to think about, okay, what are we going to do with this 13% era, right? This new era we're in. And why I marked 2020 as a new era, because what happened in 2020 that has changed so much about the way we live today? A lot in 2020. The murder of George Floyd, this pandemic, the lockdowns, the just way that has altered our society. Those are some things I reflect on. Just 3 years. And in that 3-year time span, more investment has been made into community wealth building initiatives than ever before, by name, explicitly by the current administration. And that's not to be partisan or political. We've never seen this level of explicit investment in community wealth building before these past 3 years. We've also never seen more investment in racial equity training before. Over $2 billion has been invested in racial equity training and initiatives just in the past 3 years alone. And that's never happened before in our history. So those are some more things I think to give us hope and to think about the fact that we're really at the beginning of something. We're really at the beginning of building a social movement that can create equity. And here are some of the different kind of movers and shakers I think of when I think about equity. I think about employee ownership. I think about community land trusts, community-based affordable housing developments, community-run HOAs. A lot of people, raise your hand if you ever thought of your homeowners association as a radical organization doing community wealth building efforts. Yeah, no, right? No one ever thought of that, of a homeowner. Most of us want to avoid our HOA meetings. We don't want to be involved in an HOA if we can avoid it, right? We don't want to pay dues. But there are actually HOAs that are community run, community based, and accountable to the communities. And I'll give you some examples of those. And there are also the aspects of the agrarian commons that we are involved with at Agrarian Trust. And we also know that there are permanent real estate cooperatives. This is a new model that I'm going to talk about. And so the Sustainable Economies Law Center, anyone familiar with them? They've got amazing tools and resources. I at least see some recognition there. They've got amazing tools and resources around building a democratic economy. They are working to be very deeply embedded in the communities they're working with to identify what types of legal structures could we create. Can we use the law in a creative way to build those structures we need? And so I'll highlight some of the work that they've done. When it comes to employee owned, that's a way of bringing communities into the business arena and creating more accountability and more wealth generation for a community. Does anyone happen to know the largest community owned, or not community owned, but employee owned company in the country? This really startled me. It's in the food system, hint, hint.
Organic Valley or CHS.
Those are two excellent guesses, because they are like massive co-ops. Absolutely. They're the biggest in terms of just, I think, sales probably in their particular arenas.
Is it Hy-Vee?
That's a good guess too. That's a good guess. It's actually Publix supermarkets here in the state of Florida, right? So Publix is 80% employee owned, which really fascinates me to know that. Yeah, that surprised me that it's here in Florida of all places where I am, because Florida does not exactly have a reputation right now for being a place about equity. So that's part of why I moved here, right? I can't think of a better state for a racial equity trainer to live than in Florida right now. We got some work to do down here. And so employee owned, certified, there are so many companies that are going this direction. And actually, because of our aging population in the United States, we are at a really golden moment, or they're calling it the silver wave right now, where lots and lots of business owners are retiring, right? And they have an opportunity to sell their companies to their employees. So there is an awesome opportunity upon us right now for employees to buy out their companies and have so many more worker-owned companies and cooperatives, and convert to different, more equitable structures. So that is a huge bright spot. I would be remiss not to mention all of the incredible union activity today, which is very much, regardless of your feelings about how unions operate historically or today, that's a source of community-based power and employee-based power for many, many groups. And there have been enormous strides for unions just in the last, 3 years or so. So many new unions have formed that we hope really do make a difference for the employees and allow them to have some negotiating power. So I do want to move on and talk more about land in particular, but just to highlight a handful of different things we're going to talk about. The Industrial Areas Foundation. They are a nearly 80-year-old organization that is deeply embedded within communities all across the country. They've got chapters all over the country. I'm going to highlight Metro IAF. Noah and I were really just very, very lucky to be able to do a 2 or 3 day training with them recently, just in the last couple of months, and learned an enormous amount from community organizers in New York who are doing incredible things around affordable housing there. And they're the ones with the really progressive and inspiring HOA systems. And so I also want to talk about the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative and Willow Permanent Real Estate Co-op on the East Coast, which is in Massachusetts. So examples all over the place here. I want to highlight the fact that community wealth building is a major priority of the current administration. Right? Specifically, they use the phrase, we need to build community wealth. And so they're talking about advancing community wealth building projects, preventing physical and economic displacement as a result of federal investments. So that's really forward thinking and facilitating equitable flows of private capital, including to underserved communities. And so regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, I think it's really important to understand the priorities of the administration that we are currently engaged with as a society. We put them in office, and so it's important for us to know what they're doing and hold them accountable. And they are making enormous investments in community-owned land and property, particularly the Agrarian Trust. We are the recipient of a $12.9 million grant to work with communities in 5 states to purchase land so that they can collectively hold it together. And we'll talk a little bit more about the legal structures around that. But I think it's really important to note that this hasn't happened before. We've never seen, a $300 million grant program from under the auspices of the USDA to help promote community-based agriculture. We've not seen anything of that scale before. And so it's really, really tremendous as an opportunity. 50 different organizations across the country receive funds from that particular program. It's brand new. So just wanted to highlight that this is that community wealth building is a major priority. And so who are communities? Who are some examples? Where are some examples of people doing this before it was a major priority, before it was cool, so to speak, right? So I want to highlight the Nehemiah project or the Nehemiah initiative and their strategy. Is anyone familiar with Nehemiah? Have you heard of this? So I was shocked that I'd never heard of this. I lived in New York City for a couple of years. You'd think because talking about gentrification and affordable housing is just like what you talk about every day if you live in New York City. If you have any friends who live there, you know that that's the case. People are always worrying about housing there, and that's just like a topic of conversation. And now it feels like it's become the topic of conversation for the whole country. But as we say, cities like New York and Los Angeles are often 10 or 20 years ahead of the rest of us in seeing some of the major problems in our society. And I think that that's certainly the case when we're talking about gentrification and displacement. And so what have communities been doing since the 1980s to respond to this? Because this is nothing new. Gentrification is nothing new. This has been cited as the most consequential community development effort in the country. Through their efforts, and I can't, because of time, go into everything they've done, they've been able to organize communities, particularly within congregations, to basically identify plots of land owned by the city or owned by the state and push the state and the city to make investments in affordable housing, to be able to build homes for $70,000 or less in terms of row homes, and to be able to create a lottery system for community members to get access to these homes, and then to have a community-based HOA that really focuses on maintaining the quality of life in the community. And this work that they've been dedicating themselves to for decades now has resulted in a $1.5 billion wealth building equity strategy for first-time homeowners in low-income African American and Latino neighborhoods in East Brooklyn, DC, Jersey City, Chicago, and Baltimore. And so that's tremendous. I can't think of another project that's been able to generate more wealth in communities of color, particularly in such a tough real estate market like New York City. That's no small feat to have been able to achieve something like that. And so I urge everyone to jump on the internet later, after this presentation, and watch this CBS News story that came out maybe last year. I think it came out last year, just very recently, interviewing Reverend David Brawley of St. Paul Community Baptist Church. So Ted Koppel interviews him, and it's a really, really powerful story, and it really gets into the nuts and bolts more. And so I'll just check the chat real quick to see if I'm missing anything. And okay, awesome. And thank you for sharing the link. So much more to learn there. But just looking at the way that they've been able to build power, take back their neighborhoods, build homes, people can live with dignity, people can build wealth, they can pass that on to the next generation. It's just a really powerful example of the power of community organizing to generate community-based wealth. And now they're really poised to expand this effort, especially with the new funding that's coming available. And so I want to highlight as well something very new, the Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. Now, this is a model that the Sustainable Economies Law Center has helped with in terms of developing this. The first one was created in 2017, so it's very new, and that's the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. You can jump online and watch their video where they talk about their launch. I will just give you all kind of the rundown of what this is. How does it work? What is it? So a PREC for short, they said they couldn't come up with a better name or a better acronym. They tried, but they couldn't, right? So Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is what they came up with. It's a cooperative corporation. Now, for those who are not familiar with what a cooperative is, the governing body is chosen, the major decisions are made on a one member, one vote basis. So what is fantastic about a co-op is that it's fundamentally democratic in nature. One member, one vote. you as a shareholder can't buy up a whole bunch of shares and then have more votes than your neighbor. It's one member, one vote. So it's inherently democratic. Cooperatives are inherently democratic by design. Now, cooperative corporations, they're also limited in their ability to pay high returns on capital, which means that they can't be the vehicle for making the wealthy wealthier. Right? So this is a way of reinvesting in communities rather than making the big banks wealthier, that's so to speak. And so that's an important aspect of it. And in California, where East Bay is, actually the Sustainable Economies Law Center was able to write and pass a law that increased California's cooperative corporation security exemption. So shareholders you can buy a share of this co-op, and that can help them fund their initiatives to buy more property, right? So the community can be scoping out properties because they've got shareholders, and now they can raise capital by selling membership shares for up to $1,000 each. And so what makes the PREC different from just a community land trust? You might be wondering, how is this any different than a community land trust? There's a lot of ways that it differs. For one thing, it's not a 501c3 typically. And so because it's not, unlike a 501c3, cooperatives are not constrained by, in terms of providing housing to just to only low income or moderate income people. In fact, they can spread the expectation that everyone from high to low income should stop profiting from property and live in price stabilized housing. So that's one key aspect of them. They have more flexibility to take in capital in multiple forms, meaning that their finance options are greatly expanded. So you're not stuck in the nonprofit grant cycle. In other words, you have the ability to bring shareholders from your community in to be owners. And so ultimately, cooperatives can be platforms for mutual aid and self-help, and they are not charitable assistance. I think that for me, that's what's most refreshing about this, is that the community themselves can be the shareholders and they profit from their own real estate that's held collectively. So it can pay a small return, essentially. So it's almost like putting your money in a bank account where you get a small return on having your money invested. You could invest in local real estate. You could own the real estate in your community as a shareholder. You could be part of a group of people that is, creating a barrier to gentrification coming in and displacing people, because you all own the property in your community and you all are able to benefit from it in terms of being paid a modest return for your investment. So that's a really powerful model. And I really see this catching on, and I could see this being really powerful if it was paired with rural development financing from the USDA. The Rural Development Agency, for those who are not familiar, has a lot of housing focused programs. And in agriculture, what's one of the biggest problems we see? Farmer housing, farm worker housing, because those are the ways in which we could take land off the market and still have property and assets on the land that the farmers and the farm workers could build equity in, so that they could sell the property when they decide to leave or to retire, and they own the buildings and the improvements that they made in the buildings, but we keep the land off the market so it doesn't get sold off to private investors or developers and things like that. We can make sure that farmland stays farmland. So I think this PREC model might be the key to dealing with some of our rural crisis around having housing stock that's amenable to bringing in more people who might want to go into farming or might be farm workers. And so we're starting to see the first farm worker housing cooperatives start to organize. And that could be really exciting, because farm workers, as you can imagine, really struggle to build wealth, and most of them are renters and don't own property, right? And so this might be a model that really supports the farm labor crisis, ultimately, by creating housing in rural areas that people can own. And so Willow is another one. It's in Massachusetts. It's pretty new. And so I'll let people just learn about that if you'd like to. It's a new organization, and they're doing very similar work to East Bay, and they're currently doing a lot of fundraising efforts, but they are also trying to go into commercial spaces as well, which is pretty exciting. So I want to go forward from here and just kind of end on talking about Agrarian Trust a little bit. And so we really focus on helping communities collectively acquire, own, and steward farmland. And so we have had various types of legal structures that we found intriguing to us. The community land trust model was really a huge inspiration. And so we decided that we would be a C3 and that we would work with C2 entities. A C2 is essentially a title holding nonprofit. It just holds title to the land. And so we would have affiliated organizations, almost like chapters, kind of a hub and spoke model. And we would empower communities to find the land that they want to purchase. We'd work with them to do a fundraiser, and that's what we've done. And we would reach out to philanthropy, to foundations, to government, and we would write grants to fund the acquisition of farmland. And so that's what we've really been focused on for the last several years. And now we are working in, we have been doing work in about 12 states. And so we see that there's an incredible hunger for different types of legal structures that could be more amenable to local food sovereignty. So we want to empower the communities we work with by opening up the structure and potentially exploring different types of legal models that could work better. So we could be a C3 working with another C3. We could be a C3 working with perhaps one day a permanent real estate cooperative. That's a possibility. There's any number of forms that community-based ownership could take. So we could also see people just create a cooperative and be an LLC. We could see any number of those things. Some states actually have laws around marketing associations. Rather than being a cooperative, we might be working with a marketing association. And so we're certainly open to whatever is going to work best for that community in terms of having democratic engagement. We want to support communities, however, to create at least some sort of a board of community representatives, including the farmers who are involved, if they can also, take the time to be involved, but a board of people who really manage the land and the ongoing needs so that the farmer can focus on farming and that the community can focus on, events and fundraising and bring in more capital to expand the farm and make it more stable. Because as we know, farming is a risky business. It's difficult. It needs subsidies. It needs outside support often to thrive, especially when people are in their early years. How do you pay for your health care as a farmer? How do you, have benefits as a farmer? How do you have a retirement account as a farmer, right? Some of those things are really tricky, especially for younger and aspiring farmers who just don't know, how am I going to, provide for myself in all of these ways and run a really challenging business. And so if we can create a base of community support, we think that we can help grow the number of farmers that ultimately we'll be able to tap into assistance from all of the really robust federal agencies under the USDA. There's so many programs that can benefit farmers that many of them just don't know about. And so, the business of farming is tough. It's time consuming. And we see ourselves as being able to provide, be a connector and really link people with the resources that they need. And that's a big part of the role we'll be playing over the next 5 years with this big USDA grant that I mentioned, is that we'll be really helping farmers connect to a lot of USDA resources that they probably have just never heard of, don't know about. And so we're going to work really closely with USDA to do that, because we have the same goal. Ultimately, we want a thriving rural, we want thriving rural communities. We want farmers who can, provide food for their communities and not just constantly be facing so much struggle. We know that so many farmers are going under year after year, and we think that going it alone is the worst idea. We need community-based support for farming. It's a difficult enough job that and the way that people farm is changing. Often you don't have, huge farm families doing all the work. It's already something that lends itself to cooperatives, because you do have so many different stakeholders who are interested in seeing the food system improve, whether it's farm workers, nonprofits, USDA. There's so many different stakeholders that could be involved in something like creating an agrarian commons. So I want to just stop there. Any kind of thoughts or things people are curious about? I always say that when I'm giving a presentation, if people are leaving with more questions than answers, I've done my job, because I'm hoping that you're curious about something. and that you're going to go look something up or you want to learn more about something. So we could even do a go around and, hear from everybody what's one thing that jumped out to you and what's one thing you want to learn more about. So Gary, I see your hand up. Yeah,
I just want to say this presentation has been refreshing. Just the way that you explained everything, and I could connect with a lot of what you were saying. And so I'm very interested in the other questions that individuals have around these opportunities. But I loved everything that you said and the way that you presented it. So I just want to acknowledge that. And it gives me hope because it spoke to me.
Thank you so much, Gary. That means a lot. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. And someone asked a question in the chat I just saw about the grant. It's the Increasing Land Access Grant. And one of the most important things we can all be doing right now is find out if you have any members of Congress, your representatives, if they are on the House Agriculture Committee, really push them to support this program and make this funding annual, because we have an opportunity right now to make the funding annual through what's called the LASSO Act. So really call up your rep. You can get involved with the National Young Farmers Coalition effort. We're promoting this because we can see that this is going to be a game changer for building community wealth and create so many more opportunities. There are just so many groups that we work with at Agrarian Trust that we feel should be getting this funding. We feel humbled and honored that we got it, but we just know every day there's so many groups that didn't get it that should have. They really should be right there with us. And so the LASSO Act is something to look up. Noah, do you know what that acronym stands for, by the way? I hate to speak in acronyms to people. What does LASSO stand for again? I always forget.
It's Increasing Land Access Security and Opportunities.
There. I knew it was some mix of those words. I just didn't want to get it all wrong. Thank you, Valentine. So yeah, open it back up, and if any other thoughts or reflections people have.
May I ask something? So I really appreciated your presentation. I've heard a similar one in the past, but this was a really good refresher and a lot of new things too. And a lot of what you're talking about is really understanding organizational development and cooperative development and the ins and outs, which not all of us have that much expertise in. Do you or Agrarian Trust, do you have capacity to provide like technical assistance, so to speak, to organizations or groups that are interested in this model, in these types of models?
We do. We do have some capacity. It just sort of depends. We're kind of on an engagement by engagement basis because we're a small team, but we make a lot of referrals. We make a lot of referrals because we have a lot of friends and colleagues in this work who are really dedicated and really sharp. And if we know, there's a cooperative development group that's better suited to work with a group, if we have a sense of what they're looking for, we really see ourselves as a connector and a convener because we have a lot of experience in this arena and are just familiar with a lot of resources. So if we can connect you to what's going to be most relevant, we're happy to do that. Or if it makes sense to work with us, if a group wants to start to develop an agrarian commons, that's where we could come in and really work with people for, really put the staff time in and spend hours working together and investing in that. But it's really kind of a case-by-case basis, but we do have a lot of resources on our website. I don't know if there's anything that you can think of, but there are a lot of groups promoting community cooperative development and a lot of tools out there that we would be happy to share with people if there's anything specific people want to know about. And we'll be doing a lot of TA for the next 5 years as well with our partners with the Increasing Land Access Grant. So we're going to have just a lot more capacity to jump into that. So definitely hit us up, let us know what you're looking for, what you're interested in, what you want to explore. And we're going to have a lot more resources because we're opening up our model, so to speak, and having a lot of different types of legal structures that could work to support community-owned property and land. Valentine, I saw you were off mute.
Yeah, I was just kind of taking advantage of that theme coming up to say a little bit. Part of what I feel like might be a great use of some of the remaining time we have together is to continue this conversation and to let folks think about, what additional questions they want to ask, especially around kind of like how equity works in these models. So I have a question at the end of this, but when I couldn't get off mute earlier in the meeting, part of what I wanted to say kind of coming in here is that folks in this community have come in from a bunch of different streams. And I think this is actually lovely to reflect back to you, but also to folks who are joining for the first or second time. So we really got started in July, but in June, there were a few meetings that were a project called Building Communities for Land Access. And it was really focused on African immigrant farmers in this region with kind of an interest in looking at culturally specific needs for farmland access. And then we started, I just put a link in the chat with kind of a overview, like how did we get here? What are some of the issues that we want to address together? And we've been doing these meetings every month. And in the meantime, while we've been doing these, there's a giant set of cooperative agreements across the nation around urban agriculture. And we're in a region that's really well represented with that infrastructure. There was an emerging farmers conference in the region. There was a land access summit last month. So we met very soon after the land access summit last month. And a piece of what people were thinking about were some kind of projects, like what are we going to do together the next few months? So I don't know that we need to get deeply into those necessarily, but a lot of those were about like, how do we extend the lease limitations in this region? How do we expand what government agencies and funders see as agriculture beyond the conventional focus on commodity farming? How do we build literacy around transitioning lands with all these new models, different ways of doing conservation easements and more relational work? So I think those of you who are excited about those projects or about different projects, like if there's a particular piece of land you want to get and think about how your community can use, it feels like a good moment both to ask Jean questions about this and also to think, who are like TA's technical assistants? Like who are those people who are holding technical expertise we would need to get these things done? And my specific question, having said that broadly, is so in the Twin Cities, we have actually talked with the East Bay Permanent Housing Cooperative a fair amount, partly because it was a model that folks were really interested in through the Nexus Community Partners here does a study group on Black cooperative economics. And that was one of the key case studies. And it's funny how time changes things. So like at the time they were charging 5%. Like basically they were expecting a 5% return to folks. And that felt in the interest rates of a couple of years ago really extractive. Like now that might seem like a decent deal. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more, Jean, on the limits on return to investment in cooperatives. And that seems really important for keeping that from, like one of the questions that keeps coming up is, whatever your model, what is the infrastructure that's built into that model to keep it from being a constant power struggle, kind of coming back to equity between those who are investing in it and those who are using the land for agriculture or housing?
That's a great question. And I think, state law, as far as I'm familiar with cooperatives, usually caps it at about 8%, most states. So, I just, for me, it's thinking about how, a lot of people, for example, in the United States, like right now, a lot of money is actually just parked in bank accounts. It's actually kind of a problem because so many people are sitting on the sidelines, not buying homes because the prices are too high and because the interest rates are obscene, right? As we know. So this is the worst time to buy a house since the 90s. Is what Wall Street Journal saying, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of money wrapped up that's just sort of sitting on the sidelines, and the big banks are making bank off of that money, right? It's being invested. I would love to see that money flow into things like, real estate investment cooperatives, and people see, make a decent return from their investment, so it attracts them to doing it. Because banks are really taking advantage of what people don't know. That's the reality, is that most people are not getting the return they should for how their money's being invested, and they're just getting taken advantage of. So, what I think of is just creating an attractive model that can bring in lots and lots of shareholders, so you can use economy of scale to buy more properties more quickly and get ahead of this just wave of gentrification and displacement that that's washing over us. So those are my personal thoughts on it. That's not speaking as Agrarian Trust. That's just kind of thinking about, how do you get capital from where it's just not doing any good work for the community? It's just kind of stuck, and it's not democratic. The way that it's being allocated is just by the big banks, really. And even banks like SoFi and these online banks that are offering up to 4% and 5% return on your investment, you don't know where that money's being invested. I mean, it's like pipelines and oil development and all this kind of stuff that you might not agree with. And so creating more transparency in where our money is invested, I think, is important. And that's the promise to me of real estate. And it's also trying to get ahead of these private real estate companies like BlackRock that are buying up so many homes, and making it hard for communities to be involved in just self-determining, and getting prices under control. So it's, I think a lot about this in those terms. I'm just curious what other people are thinking, because we're not broke as a country, right? We're awash in capital. We have the biggest GDP in the world. It's just, how are we allocating those funds is the question. And can cooperatives be a competitive place for just average people to keep their savings, rather than in a bank, purely in a bank, So those are some things I think about. Yeah, I'm just curious of like reactions or responses or other thoughts. So
I'm just going to chime in. I love that last part about the reinvestment into co-ops, and just thinking about that. Even the utilization of credit unions over the traditional banks to help move money and resources into the co-op sector to increase the funding that's available to develop co-ops or investment in these types of projects as well, is one way. And then another way is a local CDFI that focuses on investment only in co-ops actually has a preferred public offering that also is an investment module for individual owners as well, or individuals. The basic common everyday person can also have a pathway towards investment, and also gives you some element of awareness of where your money's being invested versus when you invest through other investors, financial investors, different things of that nature. A lot of times you really don't know where that money's being invested, and does it align with your morals, values, and ethics of in which you want to see investment or reinvestments back into communities across the U.S. So I just want to put that forward as people think about that, and think about the long-term capacity building as well. That's in alignment with what you're speaking to.
I put this in the chat, but I'm just going to say this out loud because I think it would be lovely for us to be thinking about our social networks. And who knows this, that in addition to building the capacity for these grassroots financial instruments, it feels really important to also figure out what are some of the protective legislative strategies that we might use, because it feels like I mentioned in the chat, there are places that have protected housing from being able to be bought as an investment property by banks, and that feels. I mean, just as an example, when the last housing crisis hit Minneapolis, huge proportion of the houses that got lost through mortgage foreclosure, particularly in areas that are already at the geography most impacted by racial discrimination, North Minneapolis. The vast majority of that housing was bought up by banks. I'm going to read out loud Shelley's comment in the chat too, which is, I wonder how we can organize to use these models you presented in Wisconsin, where we lack policy state level support for land access and farm conservation. It may very well be more successful to work on people organizing than forcing the state to help. So yeah, yes, and was anyone able on that thought? And Jean, I will pass it back to you, but I was just curious if anyone in the group was able to go to the collective land access models meeting yesterday, because I know that there was a working group kind of working on the condominium model that's been used in Wisconsin. And I'm curious, Jean, if you've interacted at all with people using condominium model for farming.
No, I'm not familiar with that. And feel free to say more or elaborate.
I haven't been in those conversations very much. Bonnie Warndall has been kind of holding the space on that, but she, as a farmer, and basically it's like a way that what had been communes of the 60s and 70s have tried to create legal instruments to like formalize their collective community development and land holding within, as Shelley was pointing out, like a not necessarily super, like a state super amenable to community equity. So I know that group is trying to build up a library of like case studies and the conditions needed to be able to use those models. So we'll keep cross-pollinating. We invited that whole group because we're like, hey, we're doing the same thing.
And so if there aren't any other big questions or thoughts that people are having, I mean, these are huge questions. We need, you know, a whole nother session to take on any number of these topics or questions. But I'm hopeful people are curious and wanting to go back and do more research. And I found a good resource that was put together, I think maybe Wisconsin, and wanted to share that in the chat around cooperative equity and ownership for people who are just wanting to do a deeper dive on that and understand how cooperative equity works. I think this is a really useful read and gives a lot of examples in it as well that are in states in the Midwest and you know, talking about Organic Valley as well, but also talking about People's Food Cooperative of La Crosse. And so I just thought these were some examples that would be more relevant to this group and worthwhile. So I'm not sure exactly when they put this out, but I came across this when I was looking for things that might be more specifically relevant and examples that would be more specifically relevant to the region. But they also talk about, you know, some of the famous cooperatives. There is Mendy Association of Cooperatives, for example, out of the Bay Area. Some of those are well known, but there were some little known examples in there too.
It's also awesome because it reminds us who some of the people who might be able to provide locally like specific technical assistance might be. So thank you.
Yeah, the best thing is definitely learning from others. And I will say one thing about the banks buying up housing. You know, historically, what we've seen, you know, banks don't want to be property management companies. That's not what they are. You know, that's not what they're chartered to do. That's not the business they're in. And so, you know, it's really out of their wheelhouse in so many ways. And that's why so many foreclosed properties during the subprime mortgage crisis, those properties went derelict really quickly. So many of them did. So much wealth was lost just because, you know, if a bank takes over a foreclosure, it's not a property management company. It's not going to do the upkeep on the property. The best thing you can do to maintain wealth in a community is keep people in those homes, because people take care of homes. People take care of their communities. when they're given the opportunities to do so. And that generates wealth, and that benefits the banks. They benefit from keeping people in the houses. The foreclosure crisis just is an example of a downward spiral that robbed even big corporations of money that they just left on the table, because you kick people out of their houses and the property eventually is derelict because you have no one taking care of it. So it's just really shooting ourselves in the foot in a lot of ways, right? Nobody really benefits from that ultimately. So I think we've learned a lot from that crisis. I hope we never see another downturn like that. But what we're facing now is just this crisis of affordability when it comes to farmland, when it comes to property ownership. And I think collective models are going to be the way forward for so many of us, myself included. I've been saving up to start a farm for 10 years. So I'm part of that generation of millennials who got hit by 2 recessions. Right when I graduated college, I graduated in 2008, right smack dab into the Great Recession, and then went through another one, obviously, that we experienced with the pandemic downturn. And now I enter into a time where, housing is more unaffordable than ever and rents are sky high. So I certainly empathize with people in my generation who are just seeing their home ownership opportunities get, more and more remote as possibilities. And so we really have to do something, because, it really is a crisis affecting all of us and our ability to build wealth. And ultimately to be able to retire with dignity. It's going to affect, tens of millions of Americans are really facing this crisis. And I think community wealth building is going to be a real key. So Noah posted something in the chat. Do you want to say something about that, Noah?
Oh, I was just shouting out a webinar series from Vital Communities in Vermont. They did a whole series about shared equity, and the conversation about condominiums reminded me of a segment they have about trailer parks as an example, and resident-owned trailer parks where the community owns the land, but then the individuals own the property on the land.
Cool. This series looks like it's a good part 2 to this conversation. So I'm going to be digging into these things too. Thank you, Noah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jean. It's really great. I mean, so for those of you new to this SARE webinar series is a partnership with Agrarian Trust. And so it's great to actually get a chance to dive in more on what you're doing and what you're thinking about. But we really just started brainstorming projects. So if there are things that you think from what we've been talking about today, or from previous meetings, or from the rest of your life, like, wow, it would be great to spend the next few months working with some folks to try to get this done, whether that's like a specific piece of land figured out, or a specific legal challenge, or if it's like a community, like we've been trying to engage realtors more to understand more of this and to be good allies in this work. We're super open to supporting what people would like to do. Our goal in this series is really to kind of build up more communities of support for equitable farmland tenure. So I'd love to just kind of ask from the communities of practice you're working in, beyond those 3 things that are already on the table. And I realize folks have to jump off, so I don't think we're going to actually jump into groups today. But if there are things that people think, oh yeah, we'd love to make sure this is on the docket as well, or hey, there's this other project going on, you should join in.
So I just put in the chat box that I saw the article that Jean posted. So the Center for Cooperatives are actually now part of Extension, in the same organization that I work for. And we are working with them to talk about cooperative farmland development in Wisconsin. We don't see much of that. And so we're just in the initial beginning stages of that conversation. So anybody who wants to join, I saw Shelley, you said yes, please let me know. And obviously we could bring those conversations to this group too in some sort of fashion. I don't exactly know how, but that's something that we're kind of working on right now.
That would be awesome. And I will just say, this is a small sort of side note, but Phoebe Eisenbeis, who many of you know, who's been participating in this series, and Mariah Cohen have been working with me to try to build some more resources. And one of the ones they've been working on is a series that Extension did in Minnesota last year that was on like farmland access and contemporary issues. And it's a 4-part series that they've been trying to make like a 5-minute summary of. So that those might be nice things to kind of bring together in a conversation in the new year. Awesome. And I've been
Yeah.
keeping a list.
And Gary, I did remember you mentioned this, that you were working with Kelly already. So I definitely would love to loop you in if you want to, or figure out ways to work together.
Yeah, and I've not worked with her directly. I'm just familiar with her from co-op food conferences, and I've worked more with Charity Smith, that's also with the UW Center and works with the Madison Municipal Cooperative Fund Program.
Okay, thanks for letting me know.
But yeah, and Kelly and we've had a couple of conversations at conferences around land when I've expressed the work that I've been doing. So I'd love to connect because it also intersects with the ecosystem as well.
Perfect. All right. I'll definitely loop you in.
Well, also on that note, it also sounds like maybe we could look at that February cooperative, the land holding models, and maybe we could bring UW in and colleague Raddick in to really delve deeper into those conversations. Just a thought that just popped in my head as I was thinking about the connections that are happening here.
It seems fabulous.
Can you say again the February date for next convening?
It's so January 31st and then February 28th.
Okay.
So in both of those months, the last Wednesday. And Jean, do you have a sense of folks working in this area at the Rural Finance Authority, or who might be good connectors to that?
Sure, what was the question? Rural Finance Authority?
Yeah, you were talking about the way in which like the housing work that is happening around rural finance could really intersect with these.
So that would be like, you mean like in, that sounds like a state organization, Rural Finance Authority. I mentioned rural development, which is the of USDA.
Right, I think that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, rural
development.
I really think that that has been a really underexplored arena, really neglected. And I'd be really interested. I'm starting to do a lot of research with a group where I'm on the board of another nonprofit, and they really want to focus on farmer and farm worker housing in rural Pennsylvania. And so we're looking at rural development grants and loans, because they're incredibly low interest loans. I mean, it's like 0 to 2% interest, and you just can't beat that. So we're looking at a lot of different opportunities around that, and maybe, exploring how the permanent real estate cooperative could be valuable for farmer and farm worker housing in rural PA. So that's something I'm excited about, and probably next year do a lot more research on that. And so I'm not familiar with Minnesota or but more to research.
Yeah, as you learn more, we'd love to stay in the loop around that. And thanks, Sheree. And we should let everyone go. We're getting toward the end of our time together, but thanks so much for joining us. We have been really looking forward to this, and it was all we hoped and more. So thanks everyone. Have a great end of year, and we'll see you in January.
Take care, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.